Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. My guest for today and I will have an exploratory conversation about transformative leadership and maybe many other topics. We will think out loud and discover what's in this space when we do so. We trust that having a generative interaction will lead to valuable learning for us all in this summit. And my guest's name is Dr. Aftab Omer. Aftab teaches in the Transformative Leadership Graduate Program at Meridian University. He is a sociologist, a psychologist, and the president of the Meridian. Raised in Pakistan, India, Hawaii, and Turkey, he was educated at the universities of MIT, Harvard, and Brandeis. His publications have addressed the topics of transformative learning, cultural leadership, generative entrepreneurship, and complexity capability. His work includes assisting organizations in tapping the creative potentials of conflict, diversity, and complexity. Formerly the president of the Council for Humanistic and Transpersonal Psychologies, he is a fellow of the International Futurist Forum and the World Academy of Arts and Sciences. And today he's here. A very warm welcome to you, Aftab. Thank you so much for being with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too. Because I recall from only one other session that I went into a conversation with a speaker without having a whole list of questions prepared in advance. And what I'm thinking about is the word generative. We also talked about that in our pre-call, where we decided to have an open exploration. And I'm just making this assumption that the generative is part of your work also. And so my question to you is, what does it take to have a generative conversation or interaction with someone?
One way to understand the term generative is by recognizing that in its etymology, in its roots, it has the same root as the word genius.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that one coming.
And so what it implies that when we're having generative conversation or when we're collaborating generatively, we could say we are going to the source of life. And that's why generative conversations bring us into an experience of aliveness.
Yeah.
Because we are going to the source of where speaking and thinking arises out of.
Yes.
Another word that has the same root is generosity. And so we often find that when people can relax into a place of trust and surrender in a certain sense, that we find this generous flow of speaking, thinking, and connecting.
Wow. So there's genius and there's generous. There's also an element of surprise, or at least that's what's happening for me right now in the start of our conversation.
Absolutely. We know we're in a generative conversation when we are not only surprising each other, but we ourselves are surprised by what is emerging into consciousness. So one more thing we can say is when we're having a generative conversation, we know we are learning ourselves and evoking each other into learning.
Right. Something that in the evoking and also the space where we go to, you just said we go to that source of where speaking and language emerges from. And also the evoking, which for me feels like coming from a similar place. It's like the emerging energy and where that is, where that somewhere originates. And I'd like to ask you more about the source.
So our habit is to imagine that the only kind of thinking is mental thinking. And that the only kind of knowing is a mental knowing, or at least the most important kind of knowing is mental knowing.
Yeah.
But we also know from psychological research, cultural history, that thinking and knowing are linked to states and structures of consciousness. So there are other kinds of thinking and knowing, and that when we are anchored into this source place, which keeps generating thinking and knowing, then we are going beyond mental thinking and mental knowing to other forms of thinking and knowing, which not only enrich our own experience and enrich our thinking and knowing, but are coming from a source which is enriched. And therefore, the impact it has, and that's again where the term generation and generative come in, that it has a generative impact. We could say, because we are drawing on past generations, we are having an impact on future generations. So because we are in the transmission, we are in the flow from where thinking and knowing arises out of.
What pops up for me when you say that, this may elicit some ideas of going into a space where it's funny, but actually it's quite serious, because it feels like that type of thinking is time traveling, like going from the past generations to the future generations, and somewhere being in that transitional space where we are generating.
That is so true, that mental thinking and speaking keeps us in linear time.
Yeah.
And but when we are engaged in this generative way in our conversation, we are not in linear time. So in that sense, we're not in normal chronological time.
Yeah.
And we could say we are atemporal, or we could also use the distinction from ancient Greece between chronos time and kairos time. And kairos time is time out of time, or time in its timeliness. So whatever is most timely to think and speak arises on its own. So we could also think of kairos as being in the flow, not just time flowing, and punctuating us and keeping us in step, which is
Mm-hmm.
chronos,
Yeah.
time that is carrying us. So we are not being interrupted. It is not interruptive time. It's the flow of time, not separate from us, and we are being carried by it. And therefore, we have this experience of timelessness and being in the flow.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So Chronos and Kairos time. And what pops up for me is with my awareness of the context of this summit we are in, is that so many leaders find themselves pressured and chased by the Chronos time while they're trying to deal with very complex things. And that inviting them to the Kairos time would help them to find a space to actually think and to actually generate maybe other types of solutions than that they cannot access when they stay in the Chronos space.
Well said. Thinking only happens in the present moment. We can recall thoughts, we can be anchored more in the past.
Mm-hmm.
From there, we can recall thoughts and speak thoughts that we have previously thought. But actual, real, generative thinking only happens in the present moment. So if we're distracted by what happened an hour ago and we're distracted by what we need to do in the next hour,
Mm-hmm.
that will have a constricting effect.
Right.
And that being in the present moment is then, we could say, removing some of the dynamics that narrow attention.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are relaxed into the present moment. Our awareness is no longer narrowed by past and future, and that this widening of our attention is also an unconcealing. We become more unconcealed to ourselves, to others, because we have removed the narrowing of attention which conceals the living process.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that thinking and knowing is like breathing.
Yeah.
That it is happening on its own. And as thinking is happening, we anchor our attention, our own attention, in the present moment to the flow of thinking, and we let our speaking come from that place.
Yeah. What is just clicking for me about what you just said, well, many different things, but one of the things is that when we are actually in the constricted space, in a more traditional sense, we would say that we are focused. But what's clicking for me now is that if we are in the constricted space, then and flow in here and now is not happening, then how focused are we really? Because only what we can connect with in the here and now, and not from a predefined focus that was thought out before, is what's going to help us generate in the here and now, and move forward from the here and now.
One way to make this distinction that you're speaking about is between mental focus
Mm-hmm.
and a more experiential or embodied focus. In the martial art Aikido, we speak about soft focus or soft eyes. And that is literally a way of it's literally about being able to keep a much wider awareness in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what's happening in the room, who's approaching us, what they're doing, and a more narrowed focus where our eyes, so literally how we are seeing, we can shift how we're seeing so that we move out of a mental focus into this more experiential, embodied, spacious awareness where we are focused, we're not distracted, but we are not limited by only by mental cognition, only by mental knowing.
Mm-hmm.
That in fact, when we look at evolution, we see that the mental structure of consciousness is relatively recent. And so only relying on mental cognition leaves out the full treasure of our consciousness.
Right. Right. And so, what I was going to say, what comes to mind, but maybe it's not my mind that's talking right now. Is that this expansion, the having access to so much more space to think and generate from. It's like, to me, it feels like getting reacquainted with that space. If, for example, if I look at myself, I can be very much in my head and mind. But it's not always the case, and there is another space to be, and the flow that you mentioned before is an indication of that for me. That there's so much more to my experience of life than when I'm just speaking or acting from my mind. And also, an expanded consciousness also helps me, inform me when, for example, I go into an organization situation or anywhere in a professional or work realm, but also in non-professional or personal realm, that informs me about where I find myself and what's happening at that point. And so actually it's how I translate what you're saying is that we have access to so much more than we may be using at any different given time. And it opens up, for me, it opens up a curiosity and excitement about what if we use that more, we access that more.
we have come to rely on our conceptual minds.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that over-reliance on conceptual mind, we end up using the term mind to only mean that. Of course, we can use mind, the term mind, and it has been used as such in a much broader and deeper way, as more as mind as consciousness, and with the whole range of the structures of consciousness that knowing and thinking can emerge from, and not just the conceptual mind. And it's useful to ask, why is it that we over-rely rather, on the conceptual mind? The
Mm-hmm.
conceptual mind is a very, very important development in the evolution of consciousness. And it enables us to write equations because it's drawing on the symbolic imagination. And it's these equations that enable us to go to the moon. So, of course, the conceptual mind is enormously powerful.
Yeah.
And that is one of the reasons why we over-rely on it, is because in the last 400 years in particular, during the era of modernity, we saw its powers through science and technology.
Yeah.
And so we over-rely on it. But when we travel to cultures that are not centered in modernity, even now,
Mm-hmm.
we begin to see the powers of the non-conceptual mind, both the pre-conceptual mind and the post-conceptual mind. And those powers are also immense. And of course, when the powers of conceptual mind are integrated with pre-conceptual powers and post-conceptual powers, that's when we have the fullness of consciousness that is most satisfying.
Hmm. Well, that sounds really appealing to me. But then the question is, why wouldn't we want to integrate that and have the full range, the full experience of consciousness?
That's a good question. Why we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And one important part of understanding that is that our experience becomes difficult in various ways, and we learn to cope with difficulty in certain ways.
Yeah.
And that conceptual mind both becomes our superpower, and it also becomes our crutch in a certain way.
Yeah.
And we also forget that it is a crutch. So we think it is us. And that is, you might say, the kind of big blow, because once we identify with our conceptual mind as that is who we are,
Mm-hmm.
then what was a power has become a prison.
Yeah.
Because now we're encaged in the conceptual mind, and then we're actually defending the products, the outpourings, the stirrings of our conceptual mind, as if it is something to protect, not just have as a tool that we can set aside and let other powers of being, other powers of consciousness carry us into the requirements of the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So now there's an exploration of why we don't. What is it that we then could, when we find ourselves in spaces of flow, generate opportunities to, well, basically set ourselves free from this self-inflicted prison or
Yes, it is maintained or sustained in a way that we could call self-inflicted.
mm-hmm.
However, it doesn't emerge in a self-conflicted way. It emerges out of various difficulties, circumstances that overwhelm us experientially.
Mm-hmm.
So when we are overwhelmed experientially, we find that if we can rely on conceptual mind, that we can meet the necessities that are overwhelming us better. And this is true. We can protect ourselves in various ways. We can figure things out when we don't have assistance available. So it again, these barriers to experience, we find that if our experience is gated, that it helps us cope in certain ways with overwhelm.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're going to go beyond the limitations of this gating of experience,
Yeah.
we need to become students of overwhelm.
Yeah.
And what are the conditions in which we become overwhelmed? And what are the practices that move us out of this zone of overwhelm into a much more spacious place of awareness where our experience is not organized by what is or isn't overwhelming us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when we are in this place of spacious awareness, that's when we move into the generative place of conversation that you began our conversation with today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So let me see if I can grasp that. What's clicking for me is that what you just said, it's because I don't have a better word right now, but it seems like a mindfulness exercise. It seems like an Aikido exercise. Because what we do is when we are overwhelmed, we go into survival mode. And there's the restriction. But if the restriction only stops us from being generative, and we want to be generative, then, like you said, we need to become students of overwhelm. And that means being with the overwhelm. It means sitting with the overwhelm. to see what happens.
Yes, we become victims of overwhelm, and with all this habitual gating of our own experience to protect ourselves from too much overwhelm and to function from out of this overwhelmed place,
Mm-hmm.
we need to go from being victims of overwhelm to students of overwhelm. And this is why mindfulness practices and embodiment practices are so relevant now, so helpful in terms of becoming more and more able to meet complex challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
We could even connect here with how complex challenges are systemic challenges,
Mm-hmm.
and that as we move out of the narrowed focus of mental structures, as we relax out of that narrowing and as our awareness widens, we are able to perceive the whole system. We are able to see the system as a participant in the system.
Mm-hmm.
And then that lets us be able to take actions, creative actions, that can transform the system.
Yeah. Yeah. So, thank you for that parallel towards the systemic. And what you're saying really throws me into the space of the embodiment. And I guess a different type of thinking in me is triggered rather than my head. And so I'm opening my mouth as the words are coming out. But what I find is that with the mindfulness of the overwhelm and the looking into the complexity, we can also see at the same level the complexity of what our environment is that we are part of. And usually that's systems. So becoming a student of overwhelm, the space that we gain is the capacity to see that what may overwhelm us, but then no longer as overwhelm, but as something that is a complex whole. That we are a part of and that we can also move through and influence or bring generative energy to, so that the transformative processes can emerge. So that's what I hear you say. And that's what that also does to me when I listen to you.
And this is why the term flow keeps coming up. And one can draw an analogy with surfing. That the spacious awareness and the at oneness with the water, the waves that surfing requires,
Mm-hmm.
that shift in awareness. So it's not that we are leaving our minds in the broad sense um, out when we are surfing or when we are practicing Aikido. It's just that the conceptual mind is not dominating.
Mm-hmm.
That we are in spacious mind, in spacious awareness, and that from this place of a spacious center, we are we are in our actions are the system taking action, not
Mm-hmm.
us just acting on a system that we are separate from.
Mm-hmm.
This is also related to recognizing that when we orient to ourselves and each other as whole persons,
Mm-hmm.
we recognize that a person is also a system.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. In all, a system with all their complexities and all their potential and generative capacities.
Another way this distinction can be spoken about is shifting from narrowed mental consciousness
Mm-hmm.
to enhanced or expanded or deepened participatory consciousness.
Right.
If we are a system as a
Mm-hmm.
person, we
Yeah.
are a system within another system, within another system. And if we are this series of nested systems,
Yeah.
then participatory consciousness keeps us engaged and responsive to the systems that we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so the actions that we take are generative and creative, inherently generative and creative, since they are actions of the system itself.
Right. And this brings me to this brings me to a space of when I say I, what or who do I mean? And when I act, who or what do I act from? And if I am in flow, does my system have any borders? So I land in a very spacious environment. There's a lot of space here when I actually go into what you say and where we are exchanging here. It's also a space that holds a lot of potential when I feel into it. The ever nesting systems can just be unwrapped and unwrapped and unwrapped, and there's more endlessly generating options and potential and evolution in there.
There's a beautiful line from the Spanish poet Jimenez,
Mm-hmm.
and the line goes, I am not I. I am not I. I am this one walking beside me, whom I do not see. And your invoking the term potential is timely because all the possibilities that are in this present moment,
Mm-hmm.
we could refer to as the potential or potentials of this present moment.
Mm-hmm.
And if these potentials are going to be actualized
Mm-hmm.
in the actions we take, in the
Yeah.
words we speak,
Yeah.
then this alignment that happens when we are the system, and so we are acting as the system in whatever web of systems we are participating.
Mm-hmm.
So our actions have far fewer negative consequences. Any significant action brings with it unintended consequences. And some of these unintended consequences are harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important in our development as persons and as teams and as organizations that our actions have fewer and fewer unintended harmful consequences. And that happens when our actions come from this place of spacious participatory consciousness, when our engagement, our mode of engagement is true to the reality of our systemic being.
I'm not sure why, but in the middle of what you just said, I feel moved. And because with all that, there's so much beauty and potential. And with it also comes our responsibility or our morality or the ethical or the back to consciousness again, or being conscious, or being or having a conscience about the impact that we are having when we unpack the potential.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if there are unintended consequences, then the cascade into all the nested system is enormous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Generative action, creative action, is inherently kind and compassionate,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
intrinsically, inherently. Um, that in this state of participatory consciousness, there is a moral clarity and ethical clarity that arises spontaneously, not through the linear figuring of conceptual mind.
Mm-hmm.
It is just within the participatory consciousness is an awareness of other beings and the consequences of our actions, and that mentally unmediated awareness of impact, of consequences, brings a moral clarity to our action.
So that's also self-generated.
Yes, we're not doing the right thing. We are the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah. This is not, it's just like when we are in flow, morality is in flow. And yeah. Wow, I'm in awe of where we are right now. Uh,
Awe is
and
one of awe is one of the qualities of participatory consciousness.
mm-hmm.
The present moment has awesome power.
Yeah.
This may be a good time to note that the habits of conceptual mind that are related to the gating of experience
Mm-hmm.
would find sustaining such presence, sustaining such present momentness difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not unusual to criticize and attack such moments.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
it is true that a certain kind of inherent vulnerability, a certain inherent unprotectedness is a dimension of being so present. And we learn, thankfully, that with practice, we can also be so powerful, so fierce in the present moment,
Mm-hmm.
that we are not weak, but more powerful in participatory consciousness. And so we can see the difference between vulnerability as openness and unprotectedness. But this vulnerability does not equal weakness. It actually, with development, becomes a more powerful way of being present in life, in connection, and that includes situations of conflict
Yeah.
that will arise if we harvest diversity, that will bring conflict. And this kind of presence
Mm-hmm.
of spacious awareness
Yeah.
lets us engage diversity in powerful ways.
Yeah. It's so interesting when you just said that the conceptual thinking has the tendency to and these are my words, to take up more space again when you're in a moment of presence. And as you said it, what happened in my conceptual mind was, what happened to this and this, and we were going to talk about that and that. And everything that's tied to it, in terms of the function of this conversation, the role I fulfill on the summit, all these things. And it's nice to just sit here and look at it and say, okay, that's there, and I decide to stay here. Mm-hmm. And trust that what is generated here, that will land where it needs to land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What has emerged as we've co-created this conversation has so much intrinsic relevance to the topic of transformative leadership.
Yeah.
In that transformative leaders are facilitators of transformative learning, as distinct from informational learning. So when we are creating the conditions for transformative learning, a big part of that is creating conditions where the people whose transformative learning we are seeking to facilitate can begin to move out of the informational overwhelm.
Yeah.
That is narrowing their awareness, keeping them relying on mental structures, only on mental structures, relying only on conceptual mind, as we struggle to take in the overflow of information.
Yeah.
And as we create conditions for transformative learning in a team, for example, we are restricting the flow of information so that awareness can widen.
Yeah.
And perceptions that are not limited to what our mindsets are allowing us to see can happen.
Yeah.
And then a whole other kind of engagement can happen in the team or the organization, because this space has been opened up.
Yeah.
And we are not trying to take in the next bit of information.
Yeah. So the transformative learning then, that the person who is leading in a transformative way and creating the conditions for the transformative learning is actually what comes up for me is expanding the space between the information. A strange analogy, or I think it's strange, and maybe not. And I'm not a physicist or anything like that, but what came up for me is an atom, and how when you look at an atom, there's so much as there's more space than there's particles in the atom. And then the conditions for transformative learning are about supporting people to see and work with the space instead of filling their own systems with more and more information and restricting themselves. We don't get to learn much about the space around that surrounds the condensed packages of information. It's so fascinating as we sit and talk like this, because I sense this space right now. I sense this, and there's so much calm in it. I'm one of those people who can experience overwhelm or wanting to process all the information and work with complexity and so many moving parts. But it's so nice to access the space again. And it's not like I'm not like I'm unfamiliar with it. But it's such a different place to be, and to move in, and to generate in, and to learn in, and to, yeah.
Truly, the mystery of space is at the heart of our inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And coming into deeper and deeper relationship to this mystery of space deepens our capabilities as transformative leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Space is not matter, but it exists like matter, which is why we can even speak about in physics and cosmology, we can speak about the curvature of space. So while space is not matter,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the ways its existence is understood through the fact that space is curved. And we have to come into relationship to the curvature of space. And this can really help us understand how space arises between people, how we inhabit space together,
Mm-hmm.
and how conversation is happening in space. Conversation is inhabiting space. And so field theory becomes a good way of understanding systems.
Yeah. That's so interesting. While I still have a question mark around when you say it's curved, what I am sensing the meaning of field, as in other sessions in this summit, but also from my experience, seeing systems by doing constellations or that field of space and the different actors in it, or the different family members or roles in organization, or whatever the constellation is about, is that the field is something that can be felt, sensed, experienced. And that's something that happens between people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's new to me is that we know that space is because it's curved. Could you speak to that more about the curved?
Well, one analogy that helps us imagine this is by considering the relationship between the ocean and the waves that emerge out of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So waves are a very real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't know how to take on big waves while swimming or surfing, we will have a very bad experience.
Yeah.
So waves are very real.
Mm-hmm.
But when a wave has dissipated back into the ocean, it no longer exists as that wave.
Yeah.
So we could say that the wave is participating in the ocean. The wave is the ocean, and it is participating in the ocean, but its impact can be very distinct depending on the way in which we as swimmers are participating with the ocean and the wave. And so if we move this to being on a team, or being part of an organization, or even just a one-on-one conversation like the one we're having, we can see that the thoughts that we are sharing, the words we are utilizing to share those thoughts, are arising, are emerging from some kind of ocean, some kind of source. And one way to understand it is that there's some way in which we are co-creating a field that we were already participating in, and the thoughts and the words are arising from there, the way waves arise out of an ocean.
And so when I take that, what comes to me then is that the awareness of our participating in the space and in the system is part of the transformative learning. Because awareness creates more consciousness, or has more potential for expanded consciousness.
Yes. No space, no transformative learning.
Yeah.
That Another way to describe it is through the term liminal or liminality.
Yeah.
The in-between place, the in-between space.
Yeah.
That the mindset in use has to be suspended. And then we move into, across the threshold, into this in-between space where the concepts that we were previously anchored in, therefore that mindset, are not in use.
Mm-hmm.
And new, more complex mindsets have not formed yet.
Yeah.
And in this in-between space is the potential you spoke of earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What pops up for me to start with the latter, we spoke about the liminal space and the potential it holds. And the opportunity that lies in it for transformative learning. Because even though it's in between, it's also space. We talked about what it's like to sit with that and to interestingly, what's clicking for me is sitting and being students of overwhelm have similar patterns as sitting and being in the in-between where you just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that creating the conditions for transformative learning, when you look at transformative leadership, have to do with the practice of the of rising consciousness around the space that's there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that the generative interactions can take place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's beautifully said.
Mm-hmm.
When we are reacting to others, when we are reacting to situations, that's the signal that we are overwhelmed and we are finding others and the situation overwhelming. So we can say that these reactions have a certain punctuation, that reactions are a unit of experience punctuated by biography, typically.
Mm-hmm.
But when we are responding creatively, generatively, something else is punctuating our actions, including speech, which is one of the most powerful modes of action.
Mm-hmm.
So we could ask, well, what is punctuating our speech or our actions when we're not reacting, when we are responding generatively and creatively?
Mm-hmm.
And we could say that what is punctuating our creative responses are curvatures or thresholds in space, which is a different way of imagining, a different way of speaking about field line, right? We invoke the term field when we recognize that there are patterns.
Yeah.
That something exists that we don't generally see,
Mm-hmm.
but when we imagine fields, we are recognizing that there are patterns that can be seen potentially
Yeah.
by the ways we engage. And that's what is the potential of systemic constellations, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we need not do a systemic constellation because the fields and the thresholds, the field lines, the curvatures of space are already there.
Yeah.
It's a question of surfing
Yeah.
those curvatures.
Yeah. 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 Oh, there's so many more species I'd love to explore in this conversation. But we've almost come to the end for at least the Chronos time boundary. And I'd like to ask you one more question. And that is, what is it that calls you to teach about transformative leadership?
Complex challenges. Collectively, we are overwhelmed by complex challenges.
Mm-hmm.
We could just take the climate crisis that is both here and very likely to worsen because in a very real way, the bullet has left the barrel, the train has left the train station on the climate crisis.
Yeah.
This doesn't mean that there isn't a great deal we can still do in terms of creative and generative action
Mm-hmm.
in relation to that complexity challenge. And transforming that complexity challenge will require transformative leadership. And with transformative leadership comes transformative learning. So we could speak about other complexity challenges from poverty to oppression, the effects of colonization, the centuries of colonization have had a profound impact around the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that impact, even though we don't have colonization in the way we had it,
Mm-hmm.
but the impact on culture, on communities, on societies is so pervasive, so deep, that we need to still transform the challenge of this post-colonization era.
Mm-hmm.
And those are just two examples, the climate crisis and the continuing impact of colonization, that require transformative leadership and require collective transformative leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So I find this deeply meaningful, and imagine it as evolutionary purpose enrolling me and my life to its purposes. What a privilege.
Mm. So what I hear you say is that what calls you to teach about transformative leadership and enable transformative learning so that we can move forward away from the overwhelm of complex problems into a generative space where we can still take action to, even though we are already experiencing massive impact of things that have occurred, things that are occurring, or things that very likely will occur.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. That our transformative leadership individually
Mm-hmm.
has to be anchored in transformative practices that are contemplative, embodied, dialogical, expressive. And similarly, moving to the next level, our transformative leadership as teams and organizations, even societies, we could say, need to be anchored in transformative practices. That's what generates the spacious awareness that our creative actions emerge from.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Aftab, we've been engaging in an exploratory and I can say generative conversation and exploration by being in the moment, by seeing what comes up in the here and now, and to create a space where we talked about space, where we talked about learning about sitting with overwhelm, becoming students of overwhelm, and understanding the wave and what surfing means, and that there are so many other ways of thinking than the conceptual, that there are other experiences of time than the Chronos time, and that the Kairos time can help us be in flow more, so that we can access more possibilities and tap potential that lies in the systems that we are partaking in. And that can help us to expand consciousness that is needed to generate ideas and solutions in the bigger, complex situations that we find ourselves in. And I can say I've had a very different way of learning, of sitting in something that comes very close to silence for me in this conversation, even though we are using words. Because it was a great invitation to explore and not use too many previous thoughts and see what comes up. And it was great to feed my conceptual mind with something around transformative leadership. But in the end, to me, it feels like that's all that we've been talking about, actually, whether we use the words or not. So I like to thank you, Aftab, for such a profound interaction in this session. And being open to others who are watching. So thank you for being on.
And thank you, Jennifer, for your willingness, your openness, your thoughtfulness in engaging in this way, in this conversation, while you're holding the larger intention and framework of this summit on systemic leadership. I also want to thank our mutual friend, George Poor, for connecting us. And I have enjoyed this conversation with you in the ways that I enjoy my conversations with George Poor as well.
Yeah. That's something I can second. Thank you. And thank you to George Poor as well. And thank you to everyone who has been watching. And yes, I'm going to leave you with that. There's so much other things that I usually say at the end of a session, but you know those by now. So looking forward to more generative conversations. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.